I'm still double checking audio and video to make sure it is working successfully. But this is your absentee instructor, Dr. Michas, and I would like to present Chapter 1 in Anatomy and Physiology 1. So this is 1 of 1, and I am Dr. Michas, your teacher, and I apologize for not being there with you in person. I want to be, because I'm very much an in-person teacher, but like many other instructors in this world, we love teaching and giving back so much that a lot of us have multiple jobs and opportunities, and this one presents a conflict literally once a year. And so I apologize, but I promise I will support all of you through this transition. And next week I'll be back in person anyway. So if anyone has any questions about anything, please feel free to email me, text me, call me. I mean, I provided my contact information in hopes that you will reach out to me if you have any questions. And I was hoping that the McGraw-Hill information would work successfully, but that continues to be my wish. It isn't working, and a lot of my ex-students will laugh and make fun of me, which is fine, because it's harmless, and say, yeah, Dr. Michas, he always says, we love technology when it works. We love technology when it works, and yeah. In fact, I don't even know if I love it at all at this point. It's so problematic. But anyway, I need to stop wasting your time. I am going to share screen and get the document that we're going over today, the Chapter 1 document, ready to go. And if I can just technology to cooperate with me, it would be very nice. Just about there. Students who have had me as an instructor in the past will also share with you that I tend to talk to myself a lot as well. So here I am proving them correct. But all right, so we're going to share application screen, and hopefully I picked the right one. If I pick the right one, we should be seeing Chapter 1. Okay, fantastic, fantastic. All right, so we're going to go over Chapter 1, which is called The Science of Anatomy and Physiology. And Chapter 1 is all of your basic information that represents the foundation upon which anatomy and physiology rests. And so I know some of you are in the P preparation class, and some of you are not. And regardless, if you're taking the P class or not, I want the entire class to definitely be exposed to and be accountable for the content from Chapter 1, because that's how important it is. So that's why we're doing it. And of course, the first assignment that I provided is also from Chapter 1 as well. So let's go ahead and validate the reasoning behind why Chapter 1 is so important. So it starts with the organization of the body and homeostasis. And homeostasis, of course, is a complex concept, but homeostasis really is the foundational basis of all organisms, because if you think about it, a living organism is required to maintain conditions necessary for life to in an environment that is not necessarily supportive of life. For example, all life is made out of cells, and our cells are over 70% water, and inside of them they've got a perfect balance of electrolytes, proteins, and other substances. And of course, it gets much more wondrous than that. It's got organelles and a fluid mosaic model described, plasma membrane, and all of that exists to maintain conditions for life. So homeostasis is a word that explains how the body's organs, tissues, and systems work together in order to maintain conditions for our cells to live. And the analogy that I use, that I've been using for years, is it's kind of like if you have an aquarium filled with fish. Those fish, of course, need nice, clean aquarium water to live in. They need food in the water. They need structural support in the water. And the substances in the water, the pH, the level of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other substances in the water all have to be precisely maintained so that the fish can live. And if any of the conditions in that aquarium become too extreme, like if the water gets too warm, if it gets too cold, if the pH gets too low, if it gets too high, if it gets too much oxygen, not enough oxygen, too much sodium, too much potassium, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But it is important to maintain the conditions to support life, and that's the overall purpose of homeostasis. And of course, it's a word that we will continue using throughout the class because it represents the reason why our body systems, organs, and tissues exist in the first place. But a lot of you are wondering, why are we throwing the definition of the word hypothesis at the beginning of this chapter? And the reason why is because anatomy and physiology are both scientific disciplines, and all scientific disciplines exist because of the scientific method, which is a technique used by chemists, physicists, biologists, and all scientists, even behavioral scientists, to gather data, to gather information about situations and people and events, to learn more about them. So it's kind of like the human race's way of investigating something, and it always has to start with a hypothesis, with a question. So now let's transition to the specific science of anatomy and physiology. Of course, anatomy and physiology is a subdivision of the overall science of biology. And of course, biology is the study of life, and anatomy and physiology are both subdivisions of biology. And even though this seems obvious, a lot of students actually mix this up on exams. So let's make sure we're really clear on the difference between anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the study of the structure of an organism, meaning the physical makeup of an organism, the bones, the muscles, the connective tissue, the physical gross anatomy, the internal anatomy, the physical three-dimensional composition of an organism. That's anatomy. Physiology is the science that studies the function of organisms. And of course, you can't really separate anatomy from physiology any more than you could separate an organ from its function. For example, we are all covered with the largest organ in our body, which is our skin, also known as the integument. It's the largest organ of our body. A lot of people are not aware of that, but a lot of times if you get a question that asks, what's the largest organ in the human body, a lot of people might pick liver or brain or lungs, but none of those are true. The correct answer is skin. And the purpose of the skin is to protect the rest of the body from the environment, and to also thermoregulate the body, maintain the temperature, also represent the first line of defense of the immune system, and protection. So all of those functions would be removed if the skin was removed. So always connect the word anatomy with structure, and connect the word physiology with function. And if I were to ask you, what is more complex, anatomy or physiology? Most people would say physiology is by far more complex. But if you get really detailed with anatomy, like the study of tissues or cell biology, which is all part of anatomy, it can get every bit as complicated as physiology. So I would say that they're both equally complex. But now let's transition to Andreas Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius is significant, and this is the only time in the entire class, both semesters included, that I will talk about Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius was a Belgian anatomist and physician, and he is the author of one of the most influential books in human anatomy. And I'm going to have to put on my glasses to read this. De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body. And yes, I've taken Latin. Thank you very much. So on the fabric of the human body. So he was primarily an anatomist, and consequently he's considered the father of modern anatomy, not physiology, the father of modern anatomy. So he is a professor at the University of Padua, and later became the imperial physician of Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. So he's got some notoriety connected to his name. But the science of anatomy and physiology owes him a great debt. He made proportionally accurate drawings of organs and body systems, some of which are so accurate they're usable today. So that's the claim to fame for Andreas Vesalius. And we will now transition to another extraordinarily foundational concept in this class, the science of language and medicine. And for those of you that are going into medicine, like if you're going to become a physician's assistant or a physician or a nurse or anything in medicine, I strongly advise you to care about and pay attention to the language of science in medicine, because it can help you get higher scores on MCATs and NCLEXs and other standardized exams, even if you don't know exactly what something is. If you know the Latin foundation of the language behind it, you will know. So the science of the language of science and medicine is kind of like a description of where the terminology in this class comes from, and a large majority of it is Latin. So I always tell people, if they speak a Latin-based language, like if you grew up speaking French or Italian or Spanish, if you grew up speaking either of those three languages, then you're automatically at a huge advantage in this class, because a great deal of the terminology in anatomy and physiology is from Spanish. So a lot of the terms in this class do not sound like the English language at all, because they're not from English. And the reason for this is due to the fact that most of the early anatomists, like Vesalius, were Italian, French, German, Japanese, or other cultures. And no matter what their country of origin was, before the 18th century, most educated people spoke and wrote and conversed in Latin or Greek. So that is the reason why so much of the terminology in this class, sounds so anti-English. And here's an example: hypochondral. Hypo means below, and chondral means cartilage, so it means below the cartilage. So that's a little bit of information behind the terminology in this class. And so before we get on to more specific detailed information, I would like to encourage everyone in this class to, when you learn a new term or learn a new word, pay attention to the root word, pay attention to the prefix, and pay attention to the suffix. And if you decipher those and remind yourself of the meaning of those, it will really pay dividends for you when you move forward and have to learn similar terms. Okay, so this next block of material is the characteristics of life, and this same list is something that you go over if you're taking biology. And what it is a list of all of the processes that are associated with living things, not just humans, but any living thing, including protists, bacteria, archaea, plants, funguses, any living organism. Any living organism, they are going to be described by all of these characteristics of life. Or to express it even more accurately, for a living organism to be alive and to maintain conditions supportive of life, they must participate in all of these characteristics of life. So let's go ahead and go through them, since they're indicative of all living things, including us. So all living things exhibit a characteristic of responsiveness, which is a characteristic that permits an organism to sense, monitor, respond to change, withdrawing from painful stimulus, and have an awareness of the surroundings. And usually if you think of that phrase, having an awareness of their surroundings, you think of us, like we can see our surroundings, we can hear our surroundings, we can think about our surroundings and make educated guesses about our surroundings. But and that's a high level of awareness, but even less sophisticated organisms such as plants and funguses and protists, they have responsiveness as well. Like a plant can respond by moving closer to where the source of the sun is, or moving away from an area that has too much sun. So plants exhibit responsiveness. All living things exhibit responsiveness. Conductivity is an interesting attribute. And again, all living things exhibit conductivity. And conductivity is the capacity to selectively transmit a wave of excitement or to conduct electricity. And the reason why it's described in that awkward fashion, like transmit a wave of excitement, is because when you describe an electrical impulse moving through a living organism, whether it's a plant like a Venus flytrap or a jellyfish or a starfish or even a human, it's not exactly like electricity moving through a wire cable or a cell phone charger. It is like a wave of excitement, but it certainly involves electricity and electrolytes. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the musculoskeletal chapters in the nervous system. But all living things exhibit conductivity. The next one is kind of a no-brainer. Of course, all living things exhibit the property of growth, the result of a normal increase in size or number of cells. All living things grow. And that's the reason why biologists were able to determine that viruses are not living. Viruses are not living. They are derived from living things, but they in and of themselves are not considered to be alive. Viruses are not alive, and the reason why is because they can't grow. They can't grow, they can't reproduce without the assistance of a host organism. So, and why am I talking about that? Because viruses do not exhibit growth, but all other living organisms do, no matter what kingdom of life they come from. They can come from the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the protist kingdom, the fungus kingdom, bacteria, archaea, regardless. Any of the kingdoms of life, they all exhibit growth. The next one is respiration, which is described by the exchange of gases. All living organisms exchange gases. Now, not all of them exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Some of them work with methane and ammonia, but the primary gases that participate in respiration for most living things would be oxygen and carbon dioxide. Of course, water vapor is also a gas that is exchanged as well. Digestion is certainly a process that is accomplished by all living organisms, and it is a process by which complex food products are broken down into simpler substances so that they can be absorbed. Excuse me, I need to do a little digestion myself of water. So all organisms participate in digestion, obviously. The next one is absorption, and for those of you who are in first semester, we will not be covering the digestive system in first semester, but we will cover it in great detail during second semester, and that's when we'll get into more detail about digestion and absorption. But let's move on to secretion. Secretion is the production and delivery of digestive juices or hormones, and it's not just digestive juices or hormones, it is the production and delivery of any useful substance in the human body. For example, tears are secreted along the surface of our eyes, and tears have not secretion would be the production and delivery of products by glands or tissues or cells. Excretion is not the same thing as secretion. Excretion is removal of substances produced during basic body functions. Like carbon dioxide is an example of a gas that is excreted by our respiratory system. And of course, our urinary system excretes urea and other substances. So to tell the difference between secretion and excretion, secretion is beneficial, and it is the production and release and delivery of substances for a useful purpose, whether it be saliva or tears or digestive enzymes or hormones or even neurotransmitters. That is secretion. Excretion, think of get rid of it. Get rid of it. We want it out of the body, out. Circulation refers to the movement of body fluids and other substances such as nutrients, hormones, and other communication chemicals and waste products from one body part to another. And of course, in the human body, if you run into a question that asks you what body systems are involved in circulation, please know that there are two: the circulatory system and of course the lymphatic system as well. So if you get a question that asks you what body systems are involved in circulation, please know that of course it is the circulatory system, but it would be the lymphatic system as well. And then the last and final characteristic of life would be reproduction. and reproduction involves the formation of a new individual or the formation of new cells within an individual to allow growth, maintenance, and repair on a regular basis. So that would be the characteristics of life. And the book offers you a mnemonic memorization device to help you remember it. And you don't have to use this device. You can use one of your own if you wish. And let me see. You know what? Before we go into the levels of organization, I would like to share something with you. There is a characteristic of life that is considered to be the most important and significant of all characteristics of life. And I'm going to write down what that characteristic is. I'm going to make sure that I spell it correctly. Okay, autopoiesis, which means self-making. Self-making. So if you run into a question that asks you, of all the characteristics of life, which one is the most important, the most significant? The answer is autopoiesis. All living organisms have the ability to experience autopoiesis, which is self-making, or the ability to duplicate themselves. And a lot of people think, oh, well, isn't that the same thing as reproduction? Well, it's not the same thing as reproduction. It's autopoiesis, meaning, for example, you know how some plants, and those of you that have house plants in your house, you're really going to understand this. And if you don't, just sort of like work with me here. So there are many plants and many trees where if you break up a piece of a tree and stick it in water, it'll develop roots and become a whole new plant. And when you do that, it becomes an identical clone of the plant that it originally came from. That's not like the same thing as reproduction, but it is autopoiesis, self-making. See, viruses can't do that, but living organisms can. So please do not forget about autopoiesis. By some biologists, most biologists would consider it to be the most important characteristics of life of all. And the reason why metabolism is defined next is that all of these characteristics are related to the sum total of all physical and chemical reactions in the body, which is the definition of the word metabolism. So if you run into assignment or a quiz or a test that asks you, what does metabolism mean? The answer, it is the sum total of all chemical reactions in the body. So all of the catabolic reactions and the anabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions break things down, and then anabolic reactions put things back together. So that's why they've got catabolism plus anabolism combined together gives you metabolism. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next block of material, which is the levels of organization. Now, this part is super fundamental to the rest of the class because it helps us understand the way the human body is organized. And it's very much organized according to what people sometimes refer to as like the Russian nesting doll analogy. The Russian nesting doll analogy, or some people call them Scandinavian nesting dolls. Those are the dolls that are, sometimes they're made out of paper mache or enamel, and they're like a tiny little inch-tall doll in the center, and then a little bit larger one covering it, and then a little bit larger one covering it, and then a little bit larger one covering it. And some of the more elaborate models, there'll be like 20 different layers. Well, that is an excellent analogy for the levels of organization in the human body, because we're kind of like that, you know, Northern European nesting doll, because we're arranged in layers, progressively smaller as you go on the inside and progressively larger as you move towards the outside. So that's levels of organization. Of course, they all have a name. And I do definitely recommend memorizing the levels of organization in order. And I think that there is a very handy memory device that's provided to help you do this. If I can find my cursor. Oh, there it is. Cursor, where are you? I thought it was in here, but you know what? I can just put it in here. So please remember COCTOSO. coctoso. I know that sounds weird and awkward, but if you remember that mnemonic, COCTOSO, it will help you memorize the levels of organization in order. So the first C is the chemical level, then O for the organelle level, C is the cellular level, T is the tissue level, O is the organ level, and then finally S is the system level. And then you're like, well, what does the last O mean? The last O means organism, which I can't spell apparently. There we go. So O is for organism. So that's what the last O is for. And we're going to go over these in a little bit more detail because they're so important. So the chemical level of organization describes the chemical basis for life. And living organisms on this planet are made out of the 4 following elements from the periodic table. So think CHON. Okay, chone. Like, do you know anybody named Chone? Well, if you do, they represent, he or she represents the 4 basic elements on the periodic table that all living things are made out of primarily. So like if you took a human and put them in a blender and burned it, the result would be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Sorry, that sounds really disrespectful, but if you burn anything, you know, if you take a plant and put it in a blender and burn it, it's going to be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. If you take funguses and put them in a blender or burn them or combust them, you're going to get carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. If you get any living organism on this planet, they're going to be made out of the same exact 4 elements. So when you talk about the chemical level of organization, you're talking about the basic elements on the periodic table that we are made out of. But of course, those elements are combined to form compounds such as water, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and amino acids and things like that. But basically at the fundamental level, at the chemical level, living organisms are made out of macromolecules. And a macromolecule is like a large molecule. And you know what? The word that I really want to put in here that's even more important than macromolecule would be polymer. Living organisms are made out of polymers. And a polymer is a biomolecule made out of repeating subunits. For example, protein is a polymer made out of repeating subunits of amino acids. So like if you looked at protein under an electron microscope, you would see hundreds or in some cases thousands of amino acids linked together to form the protein. If you looked at a fatty acid is a polymer as well, made up out of repeating subunits of hydrocarbon molecules. So hydrocarbon. That's fatty acids. Polymers are made out of that. And carbohydrates like glycogen, starch, cellulose, and other ones are made out of repeating subunits of glucose, which of course is a simple sugar. So it is essential that you know that all living organisms, including humans, are made out of polymers. We are made out of polymers, and the primary polymers that make up humans would be, and I should put this here in the handout, which I will of course make available to you, would be carbohydrates, of course, proteins, essential fatty acids, is that it? And of course, vitamins, and then nucleic acids. Yeah, that's the one that I temporarily forgot. I forgot the L in there. Okay, so these are the primary biomolecules that exist in all living organisms, not just humans, but all living organisms. And I definitely want you to remember them. Carbohydrates, proteins, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and nucleic acids. All living organisms are made out of those. And all of them except vitamins are polymers. In fact, I should put that by vitamins. They are not polymers. So carbohydrates are polymers, proteins are polymers, Essential fatty acids are polymers. Nucleic acids are polymers. Vitamins are not polymers. And you're like, well, why did you put it in the list? Because they are biomolecules. Biomolecules. And biomolecules are substances that exist in living things and can only be made by living things. Like, for example, water is not a biomolecule. I mean, water exists in all living organisms, but it's an inorganic substance, not a biomolecule. So if you get a question that asks you, what are the biomolecules? It would be carbohydrates, proteins, essential fatty acids, nucleic acids, and then I want to give you another word for fatty acids. They're also known as lipids, are stored fatty acids in an organism. Okay, so we're going to move on to the organelle level of organization. So the organelle level would be the tiny little structures that make up cells, like the nucleus, ribosome, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, plasma membrane, lysosome, peroxisome. Those are all organelles. So elements and compounds and biomolecules make up what we are first, but then they combine to form organelles. And then, of course, the organelles combine to form cells. And then a cell contains a nucleus surrounded by cytoplasm within a plasma membrane. Cells are the smallest living units of structure and function in the body. And then another way of defining cells is to say that they are the smallest and most numerous structural units that possess and exhibit the basic characteristics of living matter. So remember that characteristics of life that we went over, that list, like secretion, excretion, gas exchange, responsiveness, all of that. Each individual cell in our body exhibits all of those characteristics necessary for life. So they're kind of like their own salient organisms independently, working together to form a multicellular organism that is currently speaking to you at this time. So there you go. So cells combine together and they form tissues. And the definition of a tissue would be a group of similar cells performing a similar function. And interestingly, in spite of how complex the human body is, there's only 4 types of tissues that exist in the human body. So that would be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. So there's only 4 types of tissues in the body, but of course, those tissue types can be subcategorized into many other tissue types, and we will go over them when we do chapter 5 on tissues, which will be pretty soon, because the P class is going to go over chapters 2 and 3, but the rest of us are not, but we will all catch up to the same point eventually. All right, so the organ level, once you get a bunch of tissues together, working together for the same function or cause, you will get to the organ level. And the organ level of organization would be several types of tissues working together to form a specific function. For example, the heart, kidneys, brain, and lungs are all organs. And if you analyze the structure of any of those organs, you will realize and discover that they are made out of several different tissues combined together, such as epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue, all existing within the same organ. So an organ is composed of several different types of tissues. And then, of course, the final level of organization would be the fully functional, complete organism. So please be familiar with the levels of organization, and I definitely recommend memorizing them in order using the Coctoso memory device. So it's very, very handy. All right, so now we're going to talk about the system level of organization and body systems. There's 11 of them, and they actually make up each individual chapter in this class once we get done with the tissues chapter. So once we're done with chapter 5 tissues, each chapter in the body is named after a body system, like the integumentary system, which is skin, or the skeletal system, the muscular system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and it goes on. The lymphatic system, the immune system. So systems work together to accomplish the overall needs of the body. And of course, the primary overall need of the human body is homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis. So the integumentary system is also known as our skin, and its primary function is protection and also thermoregulation and immunity. So it does all of those. And for exam 1 in this class, you don't have to memorize every single intimate detail for everybody's system. I mean, of course, you know, if that was true, then we wouldn't need the rest of the class, would we? So what I want you to do is just have a basic familiarity with the 11 systems, like know their names, and just know a few words that describe the function of them. You'll hear me say this a lot in my classes, but throughout my years and years of teaching, I've learned that there are better ways to learn information, to learn complex information, and then there are less optimal ways to learn complex information. And I have learned that in spite of how complex the human brain is, the human brain doesn't really like excessive complexity unless it has the ability to break down the excessive complexity part by part. And I'm being excessively complex right now at this time. So I'm going to bring it down, simplify it. So when you learn the names of all these body systems, just learn 2 or 3 words, keywords that go with each body system, and then call it good. That is as much as you need to know about the overall body systems for chapter 1. Now going forward, we'll of course learn a lot more about each body system, but for now, know the names of them and know a few keywords that go with them, and that's it for chapter 1. So for example, integumentary system means skin. It's for protection, thermoregulation, immunity. Done. You don't really need to know anything else for that. So the skeletal system, of course, is a rigid framework of mineralized support structures called bones, and a skeletal system is for support, movement, posture, balance. The muscular system functions to produce movement, maintain posture, and also generate heat. And then within the context of the muscular system, I do want you to know that there are 3 types of muscles. 3 types of muscles. There is smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and then of course there's cardiac muscle. So those are the 3 types of muscle that exist in the human body. And then of course smooth muscle is non-striated. Oh my gosh, I can't spell, you guys. Striated. So non-striated and involuntary, meaning we can't control smooth muscle. It is sort of automatic and it controls itself. Now skeletal muscle is striated and it is voluntary. Striated means striped, by the way. In fact, I should put that on. Striated means striped. For those of you who are like, what does striated mean? Believe me, when I first heard the word striated, I didn't know what it meant either. So it means striped. And finally, cardiac muscle is also striated. So it is striated, but it is involuntary. We don't dictate when our heart beats or when it slows down. It does that on its own under the governance of the autonomic nervous system, which we will go over in the future. All right, so for communication, control, and integration, there are 2 body systems that do that: the nervous system and the endocrine system. And that is an example of an excellent quiz question. Excuse me. So if you get a question that asks you, what body system is responsible for communication, control, integration, and regulation? There are 2 answers. Both the endocrine system and the nervous system accomplish that goal. And I'm sorry, I'm being a perfectionist and I'm straightening the camera because it was crooked and you know I can't have that. Okay, so yeah, if it's a body system responsible for communication, control, regulation, and integration, nervous system, and the endocrine system. So what they do for the body is very, very similar, but the way they do it is completely different. The nervous system uses neurons, which are the electrically conductive cells of the nervous system that secrete neurotransmitters that transmit the impulses. But the endocrine system, they don't have neurons. They have endocrine gland cells that make and secrete hormones, and the hormones do the communicating. So in the nervous system, it's the neurons and the neurotransmitters that do the communicating. But in the endocrine system, it's the endocrine glands and the hormones that they make that do the communicating. And again, we will learn those in much, much greater detail towards the last third of this class. For transportation and defense, like I said before, is going to either be the cardiovascular system or the lymphatic system. So if you get a question that asks you what body systems are responsible for transportation and defense, then it would be the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. And we throw the immune system in there as well because it works so closely and intimately with the lymphatic system and the circulatory system. But please be certain that you know this. The immune system is its own system. It's one of the 11 systems, and it is not responsible for transportation of substances throughout the body. Transportation of substances throughout the body can only be accomplished by one of two systems, the circulatory system or the lymphatic system. But the immune system depends heavily on both of those systems to transport antibodies and immune system cells so that our immune system can be functional. Now, the immune system is one of my favorite body systems, and if I could spend the entire class on the immune system, I would. So please know you're definitely in good hands when it comes to the immune system because it's fascinating and I love it. Anyway, moving on. So for respiration, nutrition, and excretion, that brings us to the respiratory system, the digestive system, and the urinary system. So all three of those body systems are involved in respiration, which is also known as gas exchange, nutrition, and excretion. So of course, the respiratory system, its purpose is gas exchange to get oxygen in our bodies and carbon dioxide out of our bodies, but it is also important for the excretion of water. Like sometimes our metabolic processes build up too much water, and we can get rid of the excess water through urination, obviously, or we can get rid of it through sweating. But when we exhale or expire air, there is water vapor in that air. So we excrete water when we exhale air. So that's an example of the respiratory system and gas exchange. The digestive system, of course, the mouth, the stomach, the linings, and its purpose is digestion and absorption of nutrients. And then finally, the urinary system, its purpose is excretion, primarily of substances from the blood and some of the interstitial fluid. So the three body systems that are heavily involved in respiration, nutrition, and excretion, in that order, would be the respiratory system, the digestive system, and the urinary system. And we will be covering all three of those systems in second semester. And we'll be covering the reproductive system in second semester as well. But don't worry, first semester people, we'll be covering quite a bit in this semester. You won't be worrying about those systems, believe me, especially when we get to the muscular system and the nervous system. You're gonna be like, we're good, and you will be. Okay, so now if this was a convention or a seminar, I would encourage everyone to take a break because we're about to change the subject rather radically. So let's sort of refresh our screens and move on to the next subject matter. Okay, the next subject matter in this class is important. It's called anatomic position. Sometimes you'll see it spelled as anatomical position, and then sometimes you'll see it spelled as anatomic position. And anatomic position is extremely important for anatomy because it provides a baseline level of orientation in space that the human body can exist in and make reference from. Like, for example, if you were analyzing a human and their arms were up here or at their sides or behind their back or crossed over in front of them, how could you say anterior, posterior, superior, or inferior if the body parts are all over the place? The human body has to have a baseline level of organization in space, and that's what anatomic position is. And it is basically a human standing up, staring forward, and here's the clincher, their arms and their palms are facing forward with their thumbs out. And it is essential that you remember that, because when we go over the anatomic directions like anterior, posterior, superficial, deep, superior, inferior, all those terms only have meaning because of establishing anatomic position first. So anatomic position is defined by the body erect, meaning standing up with your arms at your sides, palms forward, head and feet pointing forward as well. So it's called the anatomical position, also known as anatomic position, and it is the point of reference which gives meaning to the directional terms, which is used to describe the body parts and regions. Very, very important. All right, bilateral symmetry is a biological term that refers to living organisms that are sort of split down the middle and mirror images of each other from one side to the next. And organisms in the phylum Animalia, meaning animals, and even to subcategorize them further into different phyla and classes and orders, like amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, all of them exhibit bilateral symmetry, meaning if you sort of divide them in half, you've got a right arm, you've got a left arm, you've got a right shoulder, you've got a left shoulder, you've got a right eye, you've got a left eye, you've got a right ear, you've got a left ear. Are you bored yet? You even have a right hemisphere of your brain and a left hemisphere of your brain, although those two brain hemispheres have very, very different personalities, which we'll discuss later. But bilateral symmetry is a concept that definitely describes us successfully. No, and I know you know this inherently, but I want you to know it explicitly for the class. Bilateral symmetry, although it's true, it's not exact. Like, for example, if you look at your right thumb, it is not an exact identical duplication of your left thumb. They're like 99.9% similar, but they're not identical to each other. And if you look at your right lung and your left lung, there are key differences between them. If you look at your right adrenal gland versus your left adrenal gland, those actually look pretty darn similar. But the point that I'm making is that, like, most people have one foot that's bigger than the other by a little bit, you know? And so basically, yes, we definitely exhibit bilateral symmetry, but bilateral symmetry does not necessarily mean identical, okay? So I think that's an important fact. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, let's make sure we're clear on the difference between ipsilateral and contralateral. So ipsilateral means on the same side, and then contralateral means on opposite sides. So for example, if I said, can you make an incision starting on the left shoulder down the ipsilateral arm, then it would be left shoulder going down the left arm, because ipsilateral means on the same side of the body. Now, if you had directions that stated start on the left shoulder and then move towards the contralateral arm, then you'd go across the chest all the way to the other arm. So contralateral means opposite sides of the body, and then ipsilateral means the same side of the body. And if you want to go into personal training, like you want to become a personal trainer or an athletic trainer, you will be using these terms a lot, ipsilateral and contralateral. They're used a lot in the musculoskeletal world. And if anyone wants to become a physical therapist or a physical therapist assistant, definitely be crystal clear, solid with ipsilateral versus contralateral. Okay, so now we're going to move on to another subject again, one of my favorites, body cavities, which is really interesting. And I always precede my little discussion of body cavities with a fact. And that fact is you are hollow, and I am hollow as well. You think that I'm a solid, you think that you're a solid human body. You're not. You're hollow. I'm hollow. Now, the hollow spaces in our bodies are filled with things, but at the end of the day, we're hollow. We're hollow. Like, did you ever get those hollow Easter bunnies when you were a kid? Some of you did, some of you did. And if not, I would think that you have familiarity with chocolates that are hollow, like a chocolate bear that's hollow, or a chocolate bunny that's hollow, or you've seen hollow chocolate things. Most of you have. But anyway, whether you've eaten the hollow chocolate candy or not, I think you know what the word hollow means. Like the Scandinavian nesting doll, those are hollow but filled with things. So we're basically hollow, and we've got two overall body cavities: the ventral cavity, which is the front of us, and then the dorsal cavity, which is the back of us. And when I say the front of us, I don't mean the entire front of us. Does not include the extremities, the arms and the legs. And when I talk about the dorsal cavity, also known as the posterior cavity, I'm not talking about the arms and legs. I'm only talking about the cranium and the torso. So the ventral body cavity is composed of the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity combined. That is the ventral body cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity would be combining the abdominal cavity with the pelvic cavity. And the dorsal cavity is composed of the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity, where you find the brain, of course, is in the cranial cavity, and then the spinal cord is in the spinal cavity. So that's a little bit about body cavities, and they're subdivided, the different hollow spaces in our bodies. But this discussion of body membranes, in my opinion, and my professional opinion, and I will remind you, I've taught this class since January of 2008, so it's been a while. Please be crystal clear, familiar, and comfortable with the terms visceral and parietal. Visceral and parietal. The reason we talk about body membranes is because we just talked about body cavities, all of the hollow spaces that exist in our bodies, and each of those hollow spaces is lined with a membrane, and that membrane is called a parietal peritoneum. But all of the organs in our bodies are covered with membranes called visceral peritoneum. So the parietal peritoneum, or peritonia plural, would be the body membranes that line our body cavities, but the visceral peritoneum would be the membranes that cover our organs, like they shrink wrap our organs. And then the space between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum would be the interperitoneal cavity, which would be the cavity between the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. Okay, and then I want to also give you another piece of advice. When you study material for this class, sure, there's going to be information from books, from assignments, and from handouts, but I strongly advise you to have a browser open at all times when you study for this course, because even though this course is primarily made up of all these words on a page, we are describing a three-dimensional being structure. And so would you agree that images and pictures are a better way to describe a physical object than words? So you're like, well, why are you giving us so many words? Well, you know, we have a language that's composed of words, and for me to communicate academic information to you, words are just part of it. So just know that words are part of it. But the point that I'm making is, please have a browser open and look stuff up. Like, if you don't have a clear image of what a parietal peritoneum is, look it up and look at Google Images, and then you will know. Look up visceral peritoneum, you know, under images, and you'll see evidence of clear, thin, transparent membranes that cover organs and protect them. So please be crystal clear with visceral peritoneum and parietal peritoneum, because we will be using those terms throughout the entire class. All right, so we now will move to body regions. And overall, and again, always think about this Scandinavian or Russian nesting doll analogy. We always go from superficial to deep, or from deep to superficial, when we talk about the different levels of organization and categorization. So when you talk about body regions, our bodies subdivided into two overall regions: the axial region or subdivision, and then the appendicular subdivision or region. Sorry. So the axial subdivision would be the head, neck, and torso. That's it, nothing else. The appendicular division would be the upper and lower extremities plus their connections. So to be more specific about this, the axial division would be your cranium, your neck, your spinal column, and all your ribs. So your abdominal cavity, your pelvic cavity, your thoracic cavity, that's all axial. The appendicular regions would be the arms and the legs, but not just the arms and legs, but also the pieces that connect the arms and the legs are considered appendicular as well. So for example, our upper extremity, and by the way, in anatomy, the word extremity means either arm or leg. So my upper extremity would be my arms, my lower extremity would be my legs. So body region-wise, the appendicular division would be the upper and lower extremities plus their connections. So if it's the upper extremity, they are connected by the clavicle or the collarbone in the front, and then the scapula or shoulder blade in the back. If it's the lower extremity, it is connected by the ilium or pelvic bone in the front, and then the ischium in the back, and then the very, very front, you've got the pubic bone. So you've got the pubic bone, the ilium, and then the ischium are the bones that make up the pelvic girdle, and they represent the connections of the lower extremity to the axial skeleton. All right, so as far as abdominal regions, for me to describe the abdominal regions as opposed to the quadrants, you're definitely going to need a visual aid for this. And a lot of students have a hard time discerning between regions versus quadrants. When you think of quadrants, I want you to think of the number 4. The human body can be subdivided into 4 quadrants. But if you're talking about regions, it is 9 regions. And this is surface anatomy. For example, if a physician or other healthcare provider asked you to sterilize a certain section of someone's body in their left upper region, you'd go to the left upper region, like right below the left shoulder. That's the left upper region of the human body. Now, if you need to subdivide it further, they use the quadrants, the regions. So the regions, there are 9 of them, and they're superimposed over kind of like a tic-tac-toe pattern. And then, of course, the quadrants are only 4. But again, I could talk to you about this all day. It'll make so much more sense if you see visual image. So this first image shows the quadrants. And as you can see, they subdivide the upper from the lower. So you've got the right upper, the left upper, and then the right lower and the left lower. So this image shows the 4 quadrants. And a lot of students are like, well, how do we know where to put the center of the cross or the umbilicus? And the answer is that center point would be superimposed directly over the navel. So you can sort of get an understanding of the right upper and the left upper versus the right lower and the left lower. So that's your overall abdominal pelvic quadrants, or 4. And the umbilicus, also known as the navel or umbilical cord, is used as a landmark when describing the surface anatomy of the abdomen. Now, when you talk about the regions, there are 9 of them, and here is an image that will help you understand the 9 regions. So once again, quadrant 4, region 9. And the best way to understand the regions is to, do you see this, these wooden sorry, wooden. Do you see these black lines that make up kind of like a tic-tac-toe board? You've got the two horizontal lines and the two vertical lines. They are really helpful in understanding the 9 regions because, again, they make up kind of like a tic-tac-toe pattern. And I do recommend that you memorize these. And the best way to do it is just for the umbilical region is always the center. And epigastric means above the stomach. And then hypogastric means below the stomach. So I think it's kind of pretty easy to remember the epigastric and the hypogastric once you know that the umbilical region is dead center. All right, so for the other regions, a lot of students have a hard time with the word hypochondriac. They're like, a hypochondriac is a person who goes to the ER when they have a hangnail, which is true. I mean, that is a hypochondriac. But in anatomy, remember, hypo means below, and chond means cartilage. So it's the region below the rib cage cartilage. So that's what right and left hypochondriac mean. Now, as far as the lumbar region, that's a pretty easy one to understand, kind of lined up with the kidneys. So you've got the right lumbar and the left lumbar. And then the final 2 regions would be the right and left iliac region that are also called the inguinal regions. So please note that the iliac regions are also known as the inguinal. And that completes a summary of the 9 regions. And I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time finding my cursor. There it is. And then definitely have a strong background of familiarity with the 9 regions because I make reference to them throughout the entire class, both semesters. Okay, so now that we understand anatomic position, let's make sure that we're really clear on the famous anatomical direction terms. As we go through these terms, please sort of remind yourself what anatomic position looks like. Anatomic position is the human body standing upright with the arms and the palms facing forward, eyes facing forward, toes pointing forward. So these directions are only meaningful within the context of anatomic position. So superior and inferior go together because superior means sort of above and inferior means below, but it's actually a little bit more specific than that. Superior is toward the head, and then inferior is towards the feet. Anterior and posterior refer to the front and back. And at this time, I want to make sure that everyone's clear that anterior also means ventral, and posterior also means dorsal. So those are synonymous. So anterior is ventral and posterior is dorsal. The next pair would be ventral and dorsal. And just like I said before, dorsal is toward the back and ventral is toward the body. And that's consistent with my descriptions of ventral and dorsal earlier. All right, medial and lateral. Medial means sort of towards the midline of the body, and then lateral means away from the midline. Now, the one that students usually have the hardest time with is proximal versus distal. When you think about distal, think of the word distant. So distal means away from. Proximal means toward. But medial and lateral are points of reference around the body's midline, but proximal and distal are directional terms referring to the trunk. So either toward or away from the trunk. Like, for example, our shoulders are proximal to our elbows because our shoulders are closer to the torso than our elbows. Our hands are distal to our elbows, and our elbows are proximal to our hands. So I hope that makes sense. And the final pair would be superficial versus deep. And most students agree that these are the ones that are easiest to understand. Superficial means towards the surface or on the outside of the body. And of course, deep means farther from the surface or towards the inside of the body. So superficial versus deep. As far as the body planes and sections, these are significant as well. And I included a very nice image of the body planes in your assignment, so please definitely take a look at those in assignment 1, which I've already forwarded. I've made it available on Blackboard, and for those of you who have received an email from me, you got it in your email as well. If you haven't gotten an email from me, you will get one very soon, I assure you. So on the topic of body planes and sections, the sagittal section would be a section that sort of cuts the body into left and right sides, and they don't necessarily have to be equal. So if you do a sagittal section that cuts the body in half and creates 2 sections that are pretty much the same size, that would be a mid-sagittal section. But you don't have to be mid-sagittal to be sagittal. So any section that exists along the sagittal plane would be a sagittal section. And then the next term is mid-sagittal, meaning where both sides are equal on the left and right. So that's a little bit more specific than just sagittal. The next term is coronal or coronal, and that divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. And coronal is also called frontal. So when you're talking about the body cavities, there is a coronal cavity, and then there is a frontal cavity. And I apologize, I'm trying to fix that right now because the word frontal should be bolded as well. Okay, good. Looks much better. Now the word transverse or horizontal divides the body into upper and lower parts. Now transverse does not necessarily mean I've sort of lost my train of thought. It doesn't mean it has to be along the midline of the body. A transverse section can be like at the top of the cranium, along the eyes, along the mouth, separating the cranium from the rest of the body. So it could be anywhere on the body, transverse section, and it divides the body into upper and lower parts. And kind of like the difference between sagittal and mid-sagittal, you can have transverse or mid-transverse with respect to where the section occurs. Okay, we're just coming off of doing a bunch of anatomy, and now we're gonna switch gears a little bit towards function. And the interaction of structure and function, the interaction of structure and function is really what anatomy and physiology is all about. So anatomical structures are designed to perform specific functions, and over time, the functions can influence the anatomy. And of course, that's evidence of evolution, which is evident in all biological species. But this next principle is the one that I highlighted in yellow, is so significant and important. You're going to be needing to be mindful of it in this semester, but also in second semester as well. So the principle of complementarity of structure and function states that function is dependent upon structure, and that the form of a structure relates to its function. So let me try to like deconstruct that a little bit, because I know it's kind of wordy. What it's saying is that if you observe or analyze any body part, whether it's my pinky or my nose or my left eyelash or my right toe or whatever, any aspect of my body, if you were to analyze it, the shape of it, the appearance of it exists specifically to complement the function. So for example, let's look at our eyebrows, okay? So most or all of us have eyebrows. They're kind of like these furry little add-ons. Do you like that description? My eyebrow is a furry little add-on. It's a furry little add-on. But anyway, if you think about the eyebrows, what purpose do they serve? And if they were removed, would it impact us? And the answer is yes. Eyebrows are actually really important because they can help us continue to see even if we're crying or if we're getting dust in our eyes. So that's just one example of that, and I'm trying to think of a better one. Basically, you know how anatomy is structure and physiology is function. The principle of complementarity of structure and function just states that every structure of everything, down to the mere ribosome in our cells, exists that way specifically in order to accomplish a certain specific function of the body. And the reason why it's important to anatomy and physiology is because if we look at the anatomy of anything, whether it's our kidneys, our adrenal glands, our brain, our humerus bone, the shape of them and the way they are structurally exists specifically to honor the function that they perform. So that's the principle of complementarity of structure and function. And believe me, I'll be discussing that in class a lot. All right, so the next topic has to do with body type and disease. And the term somatotype is kind of like a general word that refers to all of the body types collectively. And you're like, why are we doing body types? Isn't that kind of like segregating or potentially discriminating? And you would think so, but we are doing it in such a completely objective manner that we're trying our hardest to not objectify. And if you detect evidence of objectification in any of the handouts or my video lectures, please let me know, but I'm trying to be as general as possible. And again, I didn't invent these words. They're as much a part of the class as the terms lymphatic system and circulatory system. So endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph are the three overall body plan types that humans can be. So trust me, you are an endomorph, or you are a mesomorph, or you are an ectomorph. We all are. I'll be happy to tell you what I am. I am an ectomorph. I tend to be tall. I am about in height. I tend to be vertical and fairly trim without a lot of fat. That's just the body type that I have. And believe me, I've been in the gym with guys trying to work out, trying to get like, a little bit more muscle on. And if a guy's a mesomorph or an endomorph, they have no trouble at all packing on the muscle. But for ectomorphs, oh my goodness, it's so hard to gain muscle mass and any significant level of muscular development, because ectomorphs tend to be thin and in some cases stringy. I'm thin, but I'm not stringy, thank goodness. Now, an endomorph is the opposite of an ectomorph, and they tend to be overweight. I don't want to use the word fat because I think that's a disrespectful word. So I'm going to just put the word, if I can spell it. All right, so tend to be overweight, and I don't want you to necessarily associate the word endomorph with being overweight, because there's plenty of people, males and females, that are endomorphs and they're not necessarily overweight. Endomorph means that they're sort of big boned and they can easily, put on more weight if they want to. And if they did, you probably wouldn't notice because they're, a fairly big muscular guy anyway. Mesomorph tend to be more heavily muscled and have large prominent bones. And ectomorph, of course, tend to be small and thin with little body fat. Now, I've got a fun, entertaining little way to remember the different body types coming from a family of brothers that just happen to exhibit all three body types in the same family, if you can believe it. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of pause, see if you can guess. What famous group of brothers have all been in movies and shows and are so different from each other, there is a brother's name that represents each one of these basic body types? Has anyone guessed? The answer would be the Hemsworth brothers that, again, I can't smell. The Hemsworth brothers. That's right. The Hemsworth brothers, Chris, Luke, and Liam, exhibit all three basic body types. Let me see if I can write this down for you. A lot of you are not familiar with Luke Hemsworth. He was in the HBO production of Westworld. He's been in a few other things as well. Luke Hemsworth is an endomorph. You may have seen him, or you might remember seeing him in Westworld. Luke Hemsworth, he's like the rest of the brothers. You know, he's handsome and healthy and wholesome looking like his brothers are, but he is shorter than Chris or Liam, and he's got thick arms and thick legs and kind of like a barrel, thick body cavities, and he's an endomorph. He's an endomorph. Have you guessed who the mesomorph is? And of course, Chris Hemsworth, also known as Thor. Chris Hemsworth is the mesomorph. And a lot of people are jealous of mesomorphs because they have what's called like that perfect athletic body. Like they've got enough muscle to look healthy and defined, but not so much to where they look like an endomorph. And they tend to be fitter and proportioned more perfectly than the other body types. But please don't allow that bias that I just put in your minds, I apologize, affect your observance and appreciation of the three basic body types, which are very clinically important to be familiar with because they've got a lot of implications upon overall health. So it is significant and important to have an awareness of the somatotypes. And then, of course, the ectomorph would be Liam, because he tends to be taller than Chris or Luke. His arms and legs are more narrow than Chris's or Luke's, and he's an ectomorph. And the other thing I wanted to say is that do not associate these somatotypes with mesomorphs are better than endomorphs, or ectomorphs are better than mesomorphs. I don't want you to think about the body types through that lens at all, because anybody can be healthy and appealing and attractive no matter what body type they are. You know, there's perfectly amazing, attractive, healthy people that are endomorphs, and then some ectomorphs that are not so healthy. So health, robust, vibrant healthiness and attractiveness is available for all people, regardless of their body type. So I wanted to make sure that I made that point. And, you know, look at the Hemsworth brothers. They're all successful, handsome, three different body types. Go Hemsworths. All right, I know I'm such a cheesy teacher. The knowledge of physique or body type can provide health professionals with vital information useful in diagnosing disease, in screening procedures, and in programs designed to identify people who may be at a risk for developing certain diseases. So that's like a long-winded generalization explanation for having knowledge of the body types, but I definitely want to encourage you to be familiar with the body types because that's definitely testable material, and it's also significant clinically. All right, so back to homeostasis. Better take another drink of water for that. Okay, so homeostasis would be the state of relative constancy. It's the relative constant state maintained by the body to create an environment in which our cells of every cell, every tissue, and every organ in our body. They all have a shared purpose, keeping us healthy by maintaining homeostasis. Homeostatic control mechanisms are complex processes that occur in the body, and they're kind of like a level of cooperation between the endocrine system and the nervous system. And without getting too complicated, homeostatic control mechanisms are just descriptions of how these different body systems work. And they're going to make more sense when I present a few examples, which I will do, but let's take a look at the definitions first. So homeostatic control mechanisms are processes for maintaining or restoring homeostasis by self-regulation using feedback control loops. So feedback control loops are highly complex network control systems which allow the body to make changes as needed to regulate its internal environment to maintain a healthy environment. So let me see if I can translate that, because it is a little bit wordy. Where'd that cursor go? I've been losing my cursor all day. But of course, there could be worse things than losing your cursor, right? Okay, so feedback control loops, and you can think of them as being synonymous to homeostatic control mechanisms, are highly complex networks of control systems which allow the body to make changes as needed to regulate its internal environment to maintain a healthy environment. So whenever you see the phrase homeostatic control mechanism, I want you to know that it is the same thing as a feedback control loop. Those two terms are synonymous. Please don't forget that. Okay, sorry about that. I'm doing what I asked you not to do. Just about ready. Sorry. These pens all have a life of their own. Okay, so homeostatic control mechanisms are the same thing as feedback control loops. And here's a few examples. So like if you increase your breathing in order to combat oxygen debt if you're exercising, that is an example of a homeostatic control mechanism where the body's like, hey, I need more oxygen. Please increase respiration so that I can get more oxygen. And a message is sent from the lungs to the different parts of the body. The respiratory muscles, like the muscles that cause inspiration and expiration, to increase the rate of respiration so that the body can make up for that oxygen debt. So that's just one small example of a homeostatic control mechanism. And whenever you see them described in the book or anywhere else, they usually use the letters, where did I put that? Yes, right here, S-I-E-F. So it is super helpful if you just remember that the letters S-I-E-F go with every homeostatic control mechanism or feedback control loop existing in this class. So you're like, well, that's cool. What's the S? What's the I? What's the E? What's the F? So the S means sensor, or whatever part of the body is sensing or detecting the change. The I would be integrative control, or the part of the body that sends messages to other parts of the body to fix things. And remember, when we studied the parts of the human body that are necessary for control, integration, communication, and regulation, it was the endocrine system and the nervous system. So those systems are always involved in control mechanisms. And when you talk about control mechanisms, they can be negative or positive. Negative feedback control mechanisms, you might have heard the phrase negative feedback a lot. They produce an action that is opposite to the change that activated the system. For example, let's say your lungs do not have enough oxygen because you're exercising and they need more. And they're like, hey, we need more oxygen in the body. So they send a message to the brain to increase respiration so that we can make up for some of that oxygen debt. And in that situation, the sensor would be the chemoreceptors in the blood that have the ability to determine how much oxygen is in the blood. And then they send a message to the brain that says, hey, we need more oxygen. And then the brain sends a message to the respiration muscles to increase their depth and frequency so that the rate of respiration can increase. And then the E would be the effector, or the organ or the muscle or the gland that actually resolves the problem. And then the F would be feedback. So we applied an increase in respiration so that the amount of oxygen in the body could be increased, and that increase in oxygen, change level of oxygen, would represent the feedback. So if it's a negative feedback mechanism, they produce an action that's opposite to the change that activated the system in the first place. So in the oxygen debt example, the body needs more oxygen because it's exercising, and it's negative feedback because the result of that feedback control system is to increase the amount of oxygen in the body. So see how that's negative feedback? Now, a positive feedback mechanism would be a control mechanism that accelerates or amplifies the change. And there are many different examples of positive feedback in the body, but one of the best ones would be the delivery of a child. So at some point in the 9th month, hopefully late in the 9th month, that child's going to be delivered, and the uterine contractions experience positive feedback, meaning they stretch, and then the contractions increase, and then they stretch more, and then the contractions increase in their frequency and their depth even more. And that just sort of perpetuates until the delivery of a child, and then it goes all back to normal. So another example of positive feedback would be a sneeze. If you remember, isn't this a great class? We can all think about how we feel when we're sneezing. So if you sneeze, it's usually preceded by a very slight tickle or level of irritation in your nasal passages, and you can kind of feel that a little bit, and you're like, I feel it, but I'm not quite ready to sneeze. And then if it builds and builds and builds and actually becomes strong enough, then we eventually do sneeze. So that's another example of positive feedback. So negative feedback opposes change, and then positive feedback accelerates change. Feed-forward phenomenon in control systems is the concept that information jumps ahead to another process to trigger a change in the anticipation of an event that will follow. And again, describing these systems verbally is almost more complicated than describing what they really are, but a feed-forward mechanism would be a mechanism that sort of primes the future organs or tissues that will be involved in the future. So for example, they give an example of the digestive system. So if you eat food, you put it in your mouth first, and the act of chewing and masticating and tasting food sends messages to the stomach to start to stretch, start to secrete digestive enzymes, also encourages the pancreas to secrete digestive enzymes, and of course secrete more hydrochloric acid as well. So that's a little bit about feed forward. And we have now come to another pair of really, really significant and important words in the class, afferent and efferent. Afferent and efferent. I will be using both of these terms in every single chapter in the entire class in both first semester and second semester. So we'll be using these all the time, and because we're going to use them all the time, let's make sure we're crystal clear on the meaning of them. So afferent refers to a signal traveling toward a particular center or point of reference. Like an afferent signal is a sensory signal. And so you get to always marry the word sensory with afferent. In fact, I'm going to do that right now. All right, so afferent is synonymous with the term sensory. And then, of course, efferent is synonymous with the term motor. So sensory pathways detect change and detect different events, either in the external body or in the internal body. So that's afferent. And efferent signals travel away from the center or point of reference. So let me demystify this and make it a little bit easier to understand. So afferent can refer to movement of the circulatory system, movement of the lymphatic system, or just pointing in the direction of something to show where something is. So afferent means toward the brain or toward the spinal cord in most cases, but it's always either upward or lateral toward the brain or away from the brain, or toward the spinal cord or from the spinal cord. And since sensory is synonymous with afferent, motor is synonymous with efferent, and the word motor doesn't mean move a skeletal muscle. It doesn't mean just that, because yes, the nerve pathways that contract our skeletal muscles are motor pathways, but motor pathways can also be involved in the movement of smooth muscle as well. So anytime deliberate, purposeful action is taken by the brain or the spinal cord, that is an example of efferent or motor. And then if it's just picking up information, then that's an afferent or sensory signal. So hopefully that makes sense. The next thing that we get to talk about is everybody's favorite, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a term, it's actually a region in the brain, and let's practice the advice that I gave you earlier. So if you run across a term or a concept that you can't immediately define and describe, just break up the different parts of it, and then you'll come up with a pretty solid idea of what it is. Now that's a little bit unfair for me because of course I know exactly what a thalamus is, but hypo means below and thalamus means thalamus. So the hypothalamus is basically the floor of the thalamus, and it's arguably the most multi-purpose functional area of the entire brain. And I know that's saying a lot, but that's an example of just how incredibly impactful and useful the hypothalamus is. So it does thermoregulation. It tells us when we're thirsty. It tells us when we're hungry. It tells us when we're no longer thirsty. It tells us when we're no longer hungry. And then the list goes on. So the hypothalamus is incredibly valuable. And it's also called the thermostat of the body, or the integrator, or the control center of the negative feedback system that acts to regulate temperature. So for example, if we were cold, then certain messages would be sent to the brain indicating that we're cold, and then the brain will send efferent messages toward the smooth muscle in our bodies so that we can shiver and have goosebumps to try to combat that cold. So sorry, that wasn't the best example, but just know that the hypothalamus is the part of the brain responsible for regulating all of the movement and the integration that occurs in the body. All right, with respect to levels of control regarding homeostatic control mechanisms, so intracellular control means inside cells specifically. Intrinsic control mechanisms operate at the tissue level and the organ levels, and then extrinsic control mechanisms operate at the system and organism level and usually involve nervous and endocrine regulation happening together. So I thought that levels of control regarding homeostatic control mechanisms was pretty useful. The next part of the class is a list of all of the disease terminology. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing because this is the point of chapter 1 where I start to phase out and get close to concluding. Where's the stop sharing button? Is that it? Yeah, that's it. Okay. So yes, I'm going to conclude here because that covers like the primary foundation of the information that you need to know in chapter 1. But the other thing that I'll explain to you a little bit more thoroughly when I get to class in person is that I'm known for preparing my students really, really thoroughly for exams. And I do so by listing practice questions. Practice questions are lists and lists of terms and concepts with their definitions that help you get a stronger handle on the familiarity of this class so that you know what will be covered on the exam, so that you don't have to like read the book cover to cover. And nobody needs to do that. So you will always get a set of practice questions for every chapter, and I'll be releasing the ones for chapter 1 soon along with this recording. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude. And once again, I do apologize for not being there this week, but please pay attention to Blackboard because the McGraw-Hill functionality should be up and running again soon. And if you're watching this video lecture on a Wednesday, then the functionality will be fixed by Wednesday, or if we're lucky, Tuesday afternoon. So you guys take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm never, ever too busy for my students, and I'm looking for a fantastic semester. So thank you guys all for listening, and I hope this recorded video lecture of Chapter 1 has been helpful. And if not, I'm sure I'll hear about it when I see you guys next week. All right, cheers. See you guys soon.